So let me just say Shalom Aleichem.
Aleichem Shalom.
Thank you, Alan. And that is the traditional Yiddish response. I'm Ann Toback. I'm the CEO of the Workers' Circle, and I'm welcoming everyone to tonight's special program, A Taste of Jewish Genealogy. A rose is a Rosen is a Rosenberg with Dr. Alan Steinfeld. Before we begin our program, I want to recognize that tonight is the beginning of Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's a day when we remember, we mourn, reflect, and teach about the Holocaust. This annual commemoration was started as the day of the Hebrew calendar that marks the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is another memorial that we annually remember at the Workers' Circle, along with many others across the world, on April 19th. I think it's fitting tonight for us to be together learning through stories about how we can trace our roots, our individual and shared memories, and our heritage. At the Workers' Circle, we are a social justice organization that builds progressive Jewish identity through Jewish cultural engagement, Yiddish language learning, education, and collectively, we engage through social justice activism. I first met Alan Steinfeld and his wife Rena on an annual Workers' Circle Jewish journey to Lithuania and Poland. It's a trip that we designed to both remember the unimaginable loss of our Yiddish world, and concurrently we immerse ourselves in the 1,000 years of rich Jewish cultural life that existed before 1939. Our trips are a communal experience where each participant contributes to our group's learning and processing everything we see each day. It was on our last trip in 2019 that I got to know and learn from Alan and Rena, and I'm excited to be hearing more about Alan's genealogy work tonight. And while the pandemic has paused our trips, we're already planning to return to Eastern Europe again in 2021. And we're going to resume our immersive experience where we literally touch our past. The Workers' Circle offers many opportunities year-round to connect with our heritage and traditions through our Yiddish language program, which is the largest in the world and offers year-round classes, through social justice programs that continue our activist traditions, now focused on voter rights and immigrant justice, and through programs like tonight's. And before we get to tonight, I want to look ahead and just mention that we're going to continue our genealogy exploration on Tuesday, May 13th at 6 p.m. with Dr. Tomasz Cybulski, a professor and professional genealogist out of Krakow, Poland, who will speak about different databases and tools for genealogical research. And concurrently, Dr. Cybulski accompanies our trips to Eastern Europe, and Alan has worked and knows him very well. All of you are going to receive an email with more information about our upcoming programs. And now it's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce my friend and tonight's speaker, Dr. Alan Steinfeld. Alan has been exploring his family's genealogy for over 40 years. He's a native of New York City, and he traces his ancestry to Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His studies have turned up over 2,500 relatives and have stimulated a book on the subject, as well as a family newsletter that's now in its 30th year. His support of the larger genealogical community includes participation in the indexing of records on Jewish Gen online worldwide burial registry and the American Jewish Historical Society. Alan's written articles published in Avotenu, the International Journal of Jewish Genealogy, and he's contributed a chapter to the book, Every Family Has a Story. He's taught genealogy to students of all ages and has helped dozens of people develop their own family trees, and co-authored and published a family history with one of his students. He also uses his genealogy expertise as a volunteer with the Dobbs Ferry Historical Society. Before his retirement, Dr. Steinfeld was a professor of radiation oncology at New York University. He and his wife, Rena, who also happens to be a Workers' Circle Yiddish student, live in Scarsdale. And now, with pleasure, I present Alan Steinfeld.
And thank you so much, participants. Good evening. It's exciting to be with all of you. I will say to the person from Metuchen that my sister-in-law and brother-in-law lived there, Charles and Ellen Clarkson. And to the person who said, who wrote in that they're interested in researching their family tree, well, I hope that what you're going to hear tonight will stimulate you to get started on it, and will give you some leads as to how to go about it. But first, I'm going to start with a joke. It's a joke that almost all of you should have heard in one form or another. And it goes, my version goes like this. It's a Saturday morning, 1909, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. A newcomer, a greenhorn, a greener, comes into a small shul just after Saturday services have started. And he picks up a prayer book and starts davening. Well, the congregants gathered marvel at the beauty of his Yiddish, at how easily he participates in the prayer. And when services are over, the beadle comes over to him to inquire who he is and how he came to walk into their shul. They ask his name, and he says, Sean Ferguson. Sean Ferguson? What kind of Jewish name is that? And he tells the following story. I'm Shmuel Fenstenmacher, at least I was Shmuel Fenstenmacher in Bialystok. Things were terrible there in the early 1900s, as you know, and I decided to go to the Golden Land, the Golden Medina. I called a friend of mine. I wrote to a friend of mine who had gone a few years before, and he gave me hints as to what to do to make the trip possible. And he said, Shmuel, you have to change your name. You can't come here and be Shmuel Fenstenmacher. So he said, what should I do? He said, you're going to be Sam Fine. That's a good American name. So the new Sam Fine leaves Bialystok, gets on a train bound for Hamburg, where he's going to get on the boat. And as he's traveling, he's saying, Sam Fine, Sam Fine. Gets off the train, gets to the ship dock, and gets on the boat, all the time saying, Sam Fine, Sam Fine. 10 days later, they land in New York. He gets off and is taken to Ellis Island. Big room, lines of people. Sam Fine, Sam Fine. Gets to the front, and the clerk at the desk says, what's your name? Draws a blank, slaps his forehead and says, oh, Sean Ferguson. And the clerk writes down, Sean Ferguson. And from then on, he's been Sean Ferguson. Well, it's a wonderful story, and I suspect most of you have heard one version or another, but there's absolutely no truth to that sort of thing going on. Genealogy is more than just collecting names, but, and I'm going to start the PowerPoint presentation shortly, but names are the building block of what we do. So let me see if I can get this started. Let's see, all panelists. Okay, from Melissa. Okay. It doesn't seem to, there we go.
Still don't see it yet.
Yep, there, okay.
There it is.
Go back to the beginning. Danielle, is that good?
Yep.
Okay. So the real immigrant experience was nothing, well, had some similarities to what our Shmuel Fenstenmacher went through, except the Ellis Island part. So we're going to look at a real immigrant experience that is that of my grandparents. And here they are, Morris Steinfeld and wife Yetta Passinker Steinfeld. I'm guessing that this may have been a marriage photo. It was certainly taken in a studio. It's a posed picture. And I think it was taken in Europe, but sadly, there's no information beyond that. Morris and Yetta came on the SS Uranium in 1909. And here's a piece of the ship manifest showing Moritz, spelled in the European fashion, Steinfeld, age 24 and a tailor, and his wife, Ida. I want you to pay attention to both of their first names because we're going to see an evolution of that with time. By 1910, they are recorded in the 1910 federal census. Morris is now spelling his name in a more American fashion with an IS instead of a ITZ. And Ida has morphed into Ida. We'll see more changes as time progresses. And my Aunt Tilly, the first of their children, was already born. Grandpa never became a citizen, but he did register in the World War I draft. By that time, they were living up in the Bronx on Union Avenue. We get from this piece, from this card, a birth date, but you have to be careful about these birth dates. Remember, our immigrant ancestors used Jewish calendars. They didn't use the Julian calendar. So all of these dates are approximations. But there's other good information here. We see that he's from Russia, Poland. I won't have time tonight to detail what that means, but it gives us some general ideas to where he's from. He's working as a stitcher at Yale Knitting Mills and has Yetta Steinfeld as his wife. Well, she was Ida just a few years before, and now has taken a more modern name of Yetta. Grandpa also registered for the World War II draft. By then, he was living with my dad, Joe Steinfeld, on Clay Avenue, where my folks were living when I was born, in the Bronx. We see a town name in Poland, Charnow, which was actually Żarnow, and we'll come to that later on. A different date of birth, now September of 1887, here August of 1883. And on both his World War I, which was about 1917, the registration, and World War II, which was 1942, the name in Yiddish is Moritz Steinfeld. But as I said earlier, genealogy is more than just a collection of names. It's finding out about these people. It's finding out about Yale Knitting Mills and about why the move from one location to another location. That said, names are where we start. It's the first of the building blocks that we're going to use to create our family tree. But names aren't as simple as you might imagine. The emphasis on the exact spelling of a name is a relatively recent phenomenon after World War II. Before that time, both first names and last names were spelled by the person listening to them the way it sounded to them, and no one paid very much attention as to whether the spelling was correct. We'll see more about that when we get to my wife. But let's go back to Ellis Island and the experience of Sean Ferguson in our opening joke. So the question that comes up and is often misunderstood is whether names were changed at Ellis Island. The Ellis Island experience was different for people traveling first class and for US citizens. For those people, you went from the ocean liner directly to the mainland. You were briefly checked in and on your way. But for the vast majority of our ancestors who came in steerage, things were more complicated. They were taken by a small boat called a lighter to Ellis Island, where the clerks on the island checked the passenger's information against the manifest that was prepared when the passenger boarded the boat. It wasn't prepared on the boat. It wasn't prepared at Ellis Island, and we'll see why that is in just a little bit. There were translators available to help immigrants understand questions put to them. And thanks to the largesse of the Workers' Circle, we have a little quiz that we're going to put to you now, and a prize for the first person to answer correctly. Danielle is standing by to monitor the answers that you're going to type in the chat. One of the translators, one of the people who worked as a translator at Ellis Island, went on to be a famous New York politician. If you know who it is, or even if you want to take a guess, type it in now, and we'll see who the winner is.
We got it already. That was quick.
Oh my goodness. Danielle, do you want to reveal the answer?
Yeah, just give me a second because it's just scrolling super fast. I've got to go back to the first person who. One more second, bear with me.
Okay.
Scrolling back. Everybody was within a minute of each other, so that's
Wow.
pretty awesome. Sharon with a Y, Sharon November. DM me your mailing address using the chat feature, and I'll be in touch.
And tell them tell Sharon what you won.
Sharon won a Workers' Circle branded tote bag.
Congratulations, Sharon. Indeed, Fiorello LaGuardia worked for the Foreign Service before he went on to become mayor. And while in Europe, learned a great number of languages. He spoke 6 languages, Yiddish among them. And this came in of great value as a translator at Ellis Island. So the possibility of a Sean Ferguson type moment really didn't exist. If the immigrant was cleared, they were released to a relative, and about 20% of the people were detained. Half of those for health reasons and half for legal reasons, most commonly because there wasn't a relative readily available to pick them up, or because there was concern that they would become a public charge, that they didn't have enough money to support themselves. And ultimately, about 2% were denied entry to the United States. There was simply no time for a name change to be made on Ellis Island. It was the main arrival point for immigrants from 1892 to 1954, with a short break in the early 1890s because of a fire when they went back to using the barge office at the tip of Manhattan. More than 12 million people have passed through Ellis Island, with 1907 setting the record at over 1 million people. So 1909 was not far behind that, a very busy time. And not only was there no time for a name change, but it was also against immigration department rules. But there was one notable exception, and some of the experienced genealogists among you may know this story. So Danielle, do you think we can do one more question?
Sure.
Okay. What was the name of the one person who in fact had I gave that part away, had his name changed at Ellis Island? Now, this is a tough one. I don't know that the name is readily known. And please, no cheating, no Googling and putting it in. It's a lovely tote bag, but let's be honest about it. So I'm going to keep going. And Danielle, I want you to, you don't know the answer, do you, Danielle?
No, this was a bonus question.
This is a bonus question. So let me know when you get some answers. And if you don't have it by the time I reveal it here, that bag will go unclaimed.
All right. So we have
And there's the name, Frank Woodhull. No takers, Danielle?
Frank. I don't see it, but let me just double check. What did Frank change it to?
Well, we'll see that in just a moment.
Because I don't see the original name. I don't think we've got a taker here.
Okay. So in 1908, Frank Woodhull left England, heading back to the United States on the SS New York. Here's his departure list, the departure list showing his name. A few ports in Europe had lists of people who were leaving, Hamburg being one of the prominent ones for our immigrants. Most ports, however, didn't care who left. It was just the arriving ports. But here we see Frank leaving England, 1908, and the matching arrival manifest for the SS New York about 8 days later. Well, we can make out under the cross out here, Woodhull Frank, but it's crossed out and Johnson Mary is written in over it. How did that come to be? Well, Mary Johnson was held for special inquiry, one of those 20% of people who weren't just passed on through. And it says that she entered as Frank Woodhull, traveling in male attire. The Leonard is the name of the officer who pulled him/her aside. This made international news. The New York Times, the day after arrival, reported, as you see here, she posed as a man for 15 years. Frank Woodhull, passenger on the New York, was in fact Mary Johnson, and her secret was at last disclosed. Frank, or Mary, I should say, was held for a special inquiry, and we have her testimony. And it was reported in the New York Times over the ensuing couple of days. My life has always been a struggle. I come of an English-Canadian family and have most of my life to make all alone. 30 years ago, when I was 20, my father died and I was thrown entirely on my own resources. I came to this country, young girl, this country being the US, a young girl, and went west to make my way. For 15 years, I struggled on. The hair on my face was a misfortune. It was often the subject of rude jest and caused me endless embarrassment. The struggle was awful, but I had to live somehow, and so I went on. Then came a time 15 years ago when I got desperate. I had been told that I looked like a man, and I knew that in Canada, some women have put on men's clothes and do men's work. So the thought took shape in my mind. If these women had done it, why could not I, who looked like a man? I bought men's clothes and began to wear them. Then things changed. I had prospects. My occupation I have given here is canvasser, but I've done many things. I've sold books, lightning rods, and worked in stores. Never once was I suspected that I was other than Frank Woodhull. What happened at Ellis Island was as follows. Mary Johnson, aka Frank Woodhull, had gone to England from the US on vacation. He was not a US citizen, so upon his return to the US, inspectors looked at him at Ellis Island and thought that he looked pale and thin, so pulled him aside for examination. Again, in Frank's own words, he said, "Oh, please don't examine me," and revealed that he was a woman. He was brought to the Board of Special Inquiry, and the results were, as we have seen, his name on the ship manifest was changed from Frank Woodhull to Mary Johnson. The only documented incident of a name being changed at Ellis Island. So having debunked that myth, let's look at when, where, and why names were changed. And in doing so, we're going to look at some of the kinds of documents available to genealogists and start to understand what I call genealogical thinking. We'll come back to that in a moment. But first, I'm going to ask Danielle if there are any questions in the chat that you think need addressing.
Someone asked about when immigrants entered prior to 1892.
Oh, a great question. Not only prior to 1892, but after 1892, a variety of not only ports, but land crossings were available to immigrants, so that there are arrival records from Boston, Philadelphia, let's see, further south in Texas at Galveston. There are arrival records down around Savannah and Charleston. On the West Coast, Seattle had a very active point. And coming in from Canada, there are land crossing records that have information comparable to a ship manifest from Rouse's Point in upstate New York. There was also a crossing near Detroit. And for people coming from Mexico, there was, I'm not sure where that crossing was, but there are land crossing records, I believe, from the El Paso area. And those are all indexed and available. Good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. We have another question. Someone found relatives that came through Canada at the Vermont border, but wanted to know how they got to Pennsylvania.
Probably by train. There were trains that ran down to New York City, so most likely it was by train.
And Marsha wants to know if there's a way someone would find name change documentation or documentation for someone that might have taken their wife's name because it was easier to pronounce.
Well, we're not going to talk about that exact question, but name change is what the bulk of what I'm going to be discussing tonight is. So I'm going to put that one aside. And Danielle, I'd like you to jot that down so that I don't forget it when we get to the end of the material I've prepared and can come back to it. That's actually not an uncommon situation, but it happened more frequently in Europe than it did here, where people took their mother's maiden name, and there are very specific reasons as to why that happened. So I'm going to continue now and talk about name changes. Frequently, it happened before the immigrant got on the boat, because as we've seen, the name wasn't changed once they got on the boat and then landed in the United States. For example, I know that Moritz Steinfeld was not my grandfather's real name. We may have time for that towards the end of the hour. Commonly, a name could be changed when the person applied for citizenship. We'll see an example of that. It could also be done legally through court action. I've never read any numbers as to how many people did this, and these records are surprisingly hard to find because any court could do it. Again, we'll talk more about that when I show you the example. And another way is by common usage. That is, a person simply starts using a different name, or usually a variant of their original name, and they just do it, and that becomes their legal name. There's nothing illegal about that as long as you don't do it for fraudulent reasons. So let's look at citizenship. It's basically a three-step process, or at least was back in the days of our immigrant ancestors. You declared your intention to become a citizen. You then petitioned the court for citizenship and received the certificate of citizenship. The process leaves a very nice paper trail, usually. So applying for citizenship, you could declare your intention to become a citizen 2 years after arriving in this country. 3 years after that declaration, you could petition the court for citizenship. And one of the issues for genealogists is that until 1906, most any court could receive a petition for citizenship and granted if they found no reasons not to. So records can be spread out, or early records before the federal government took over the process could be anywhere. And unfortunately, the amount of information that those courts required could be nothing more than the person saying, I want to be a citizen, and there you have it. So here's an example of a petition for naturalization. So this would have been 5 years after the person came to at least 5 years after, and at least 3 years after they declared their intention. And it's for a cousin of mine named William Kokoschka, but he was formerly Will Kokoschka. So here's an instance of someone changing their name at the time of citizenship. And we see that Will came on the SS New Amsterdam on August 10th of 1908. Now that's what he put down when he declared his intention to become a citizen, but the court would not take his word for it. They went back to the immigration service and said, can you confirm that he was indeed on the boat? And the immigration people issued a certificate of arrival. They went back to the ship manifest for the SS New Amsterdam, arriving in August of 1908, and said, indeed, Will Kokoschka was on that boat. And they issued that certificate in 1941 when he was going to become a citizen. A nice clean paper trail showing the name change. And here's the third document. This is the certificate of naturalization, oftentimes with a nice picture. And of the three documents, the declaration, the petition, and the certificate, it's the certificate that's the handsomest, but has the least information. It really gives you a little bit of physical description, but tells you nothing about when and where they were born. It lacks a lot of stuff that would be helpful in going back in time, but it's certainly handsome to look at. So that's one common way to change the name by becoming a citizen. Another way is to legally change it by asking the court. And here, another example from my research, family members named Doroshkin became Dorin, and some more changes. So here's the Doroshkin family as shown in the 1920 federal census: Sam and wife Ida, and 3 children, Abraham, Lena, and Reuben. Now, I want you to pay attention to some ages. Abraham in 1920 was 12 years old. His sister Lena was 10 years old. By 1940, Sam and Ida had died, and Lena over here had gotten married. Now I knew that. I found the marriage record for Lena to Mr. Rubin. And here they are in the 1940 federal census. Here's cousin Lena, who now took the more modern name of Lee, but we see that she's 30 years old. And back here in 1920, she was 10, so that fits very nicely. Living with them are three men named Dorin, all described as brother-in-law. Now, if you're not familiar with the census, the relationship column pertains to the head of the family, in this case, Jack Rubin, so that he has a wife, and these are his brother-in-law, so they must be Lee's brothers. But up here we see Lee didn't have a brother Al, she had a brother Abraham. And there's a brother Irving here who doesn't appear here at all. Well, we can fit this together by saying that Abraham changed his name to Al, and we see he's 32, whereas he was 12 in 1920. Again, that fits very nicely. And Irving is only 17. He wasn't born in 1920, so it makes sense that he wouldn't be there. Can we document that? And indeed, if you look in the New York Post for April of 1948, in the legal notices columns, you'll see a petition for change of name. The old name, Irving and Reuben Doroshkin. The new name, Irving and Reuben Dorin. Notice Al isn't mentioned here, and either he never applied to legally change his name or did it at a different time. And here, thanks to a neighbor of mine who used to work for the New York Post and was able to get into their archives, we have the actual column from the legal notices. In the matter of application of Irving Doroshkin and Reuben Doroshkin for leave to change their names to Irving Dorin and Reuben Dorin. Now, I knew about this legal notice from the work of a volunteer group that indexed some of these legal notices, but largely this information is unindexed and exquisitely hard to find without either going through the newspapers page by page or going through court records. We again have the problem of name changes being issued by any court, and the court requires that a notice be put in the newspaper that the court thinks is going to be widely read by people in that area. So this is a batch of data waiting to be indexed and made available. It hasn't yet. And now, hopefully,
take my wife, please.
Since we're talking about names, I hope you all recognize Henny Youngman, one of the greats of the Borscht Belt. His name was originally Henry Jungmann, and he is certainly the king of the one-liners. He wrote comedy cards in his early career, creating one-line gags while working in a print shop. And these would be things that other Borscht Belt comics, Milton Berle, etc., Danny Kaye would use. He also led a small jazz band and was a reasonably good violin player. One night, the regular comedian on the bill couldn't make it, and that launched his career as a very successful comedian. But I tell you all of that because I want you to take my wife as an example of name changes. This is the woman, as Anne said, now known as Rena Steinfeld. She was born in a DP camp in Hof, Germany, her parents having fled the Nazis from Poland in 1939, went to Siberia, then to Tashkent, ultimately back to Poland, which was not a place for Jews to be in 1946. So they went further west to Germany and were in a DP camp for 3 years, where my wife was born. She was named Rivka Hannah Sperber, named for her grandmother Rivka, with a middle name Hannah to differentiate her from the other Rivkas descended from that same grandmother. And here's a translation of her birth record, born 14 September 1946, and her name is Anna Regina Sperber. So the Rivka had morphed into Regina, the Hannah into Anna, and importantly, the order had been reversed. By her first birthday, the Rivka was gone, and she was just Anna Sperber. They left the settlement camp. They left the DP camp for a settlement camp, and then were put on a plane in 1949 for the U.S. And here they are. Here she is as Anna Sperber. She indeed becomes a citizen, and the Rivka has now changed to Regina, but become a middle name. She meets the handsome young guy here at City College, and this is taken on their first date in 1965. And things progress so that they went to the Concord Hotel in the winter of '67, already engaged. And indeed got married in 1968, where she is now Rena. The Regina has become Rena. The Anna is back as a middle name. And here she is back as Regina, because all of her Social Security application was made as Regina. And now, as she has become a woman of a certain age and needs Medicare and all that good stuff, all of her IDs need to be in order. So she's back as Regina. I've got one more story for you, but this is a good time to take a break, Danielle, and see if we have any more questions.
A lot of them are very personal. We've got no less than 4 people with the last name Steinfeld, including you, on this chat. And then one question, was people actually were really great. They answered it in the chat. People wanted to know when women became naturalized versus required citizenship versus taking naturalization by marriage.
Yeah, the issue with women and naturalization, there was a period of time when they were naturalized automatically when their husbands became citizens. There was also an interesting period, excuse me, when if a woman who was a citizen married a man who wasn't a citizen, she lost her citizenship. A bizarre period of time. The other Steinfelds, that's interesting because it's not a real common name. And unless you're my cousins who are watching, we're not related. And I think I'm going to have time to explain why. So Danielle, should I keep going, or do you have a question?
Yeah, I have another question. Someone's last name, Should I do name changes or should I save those for the very end?
Say that again?
Should I do name changes or should I save those for the very end?
I'm sorry, one more time.
I have a question. It's about when someone's great-grandfather's name changed. Should I ask those questions now or save those for the very end?
Give me one of them.
Okay, someone's great-grandfather's name changed from Zarek Yehuda to Libel or Liebel. How? Does Liebel mean lion, a symbol of the tribe of Yehuda?
No, Lieb means heart. But sometimes with name changes like that, if you go back, and look at the gravestone, you'll find that many Jewish men and many European Jewish men and women have two names, a first name and a middle name, and they will use one or the other so that, I'm sorry, need another cough drop. They'll use one or the other, and that seems to be a name change, but it really isn't. So when you see that sort of thing, try to find some documentation of what their name was in Europe, and a gravestone is a good place to look for it.
Then some people just want to know what's the best way to get started. If you're just starting with a common name or a grandparent's name, what's the best way to begin?
Well, that's a good introduction to the source sheet that I gave you, Danielle. And are you going to tell people about that? How are we going to get that information out?
Absolutely. So after this program concludes, we will send you a thank you email with a bunch of really great resources that Alan compiled that he just recommends checking out. I'm not sure if we're going to include them as a PDF or give them a special home on the Workers Circle website. We're still working on that, but you will have a list of 6 or 7 really top-notch sites, that some of which I've heard of and some of which are just new to me, that are good places to just look on the web.
What Danielle doesn't know is that there's also talk of the Workers Circle sponsoring a Introduction to Jewish Genealogy course, which will be available for a very modest sum. You should keep an eye on the Workers Circle website for information about that. If you've registered for this, I think it would be pretty easy for you to be contacted by the Workers Circle. Ann Toback, are you there? No, Ann's not there, but
I am here. I am here.
She's there. She was muted, but
okay.
I emailed.
That's a little surprise you don't know about yet.
I didn't know, and I was just, oh, sorry, my dog is very excited too. I'm going to mute again.
Okay, I'm going to go quickly. I'll need 10 seconds to get some more water because my throat's giving out, so don't go away.
I was thinking, again, my apologies for my dog. Maybe people can put in the chat name changes. So mine was Tabachnikov to Toback. I think people can put, I think you're doing it, but maybe put some other fun facts like that.
Okay, I have one more story and maybe one more after that. So here's Grandma and Grandpa again, who you met at the beginning. And Grandma died very early, unfortunately, leaving Grandpa with Uncle Ted and Tilly, who we met in the 1910 census, and my dad, Joe. But there was another child. And when I started my research, I learned about this. Both my father and his siblings all said there was another child. They were sure it was a boy, and they thought his name was something like Izzy. So remember I mentioned genealogical thinking. Well, that involves approaching a genealogy problem by figuring out what records should exist for a person who was alive in a certain place at a certain time. Here's the birth order of those siblings. Aunt Tilly in 1910, Uncle Ted in 1914, my dad in 1915. And looking at this, you see a gap between Mildred and Tony. So I wanted to know who he was, when he was born, and what happened to him. If he was born after Joseph, then Mildred, who would have been 6 or 7 or 8, would probably remember what became of him, and she didn't. He doesn't appear in the 1915 or 1920 censuses, so there's a good bet that he was born and presumably died before 1915. That 4-year gap between Mildred and Tony certainly gave me a window for my inquiry. So I was looking for a Steinfeld, born in Manhattan between 1910 and 1914, and I couldn't find one. Now, this was back in the 70s. Records weren't indexed. There was certainly no internet that you could go on. Looking for records meant going down to the municipal archives in Lower Manhattan and cranking through microfilm. Thousands and thousands of microfilm, since I had no idea when he would have died. I say died because the birth records before 1909 are not publicly available. But eventually, as records were indexed, I found a death record, standard certificate of death, for Isidore Steinfeld, June 30th, 1913. And in fact, father was Morris and his mother Esther Patzinker, and that is indeed the family name that I knew. So this was my uncle Isidore. And down here we see where he's buried, section MR Ocean View. MR, I would learn, means Mount Richmond, which was the kind of the burial ground for the indigent. That will feature, that we'll hear about more of that later on. Well, now I thought it would be very easy. I knew how old he was, 17 months when he died, exactly when he died, and I just needed to look for a birth record for Isidore Steinfeld. As a relative, I would have access to that, and I looked and I looked and I looked and found nothing. And it took me years waiting for more records to become indexed before I found the certificate of record of birth for Isaac Steinfeld, born January 26, 1912, to Moritz Steinfeld and Ida Steinfeld. So this was my uncle. So why Isaac to Isidore? The likely explanation, I think, is that it was a language problem, that when this sick, dying 17-month-old baby was brought into the hospital, the parents said something that sounded like Isidore, and that's what was written down ultimately on his medical record and on his death record. But there's another possibility that has to do with blocking the word, a superstition, that if someone is very sick, potentially dying, if you change their name, it will fool the angel of death, and the angel won't know who to go and whose soul to collect. So was that what figured in? Was this a conscious thing that my grandparents did? I don't know, and I won't ever know. but seeing his death certificate allowed me to find his burial place at Mount Richmond and to arrange to have a stone put up in his memory. Danielle, I see we're approaching 8 o'clock. Is there time for another story, or should we just take a couple of questions?
Let's just take a couple of questions, since I know
Okay.
we tend to run pretty long.
Okay, I'm going to stop the screen share and go ahead.
So,
No, just go ahead.
no, well, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, we've got one more for the, let's see, we still have 140 people here. Wow, thank you for staying. So we've got one more trivia question for you. For those of you who were here at the beginning and were paying close attention, now Danielle, you're gonna have, I think we're gonna have a bunch of people answer this correctly. What was the year of arrival of my grandparents at Ellis Island?
Damn, we got it. That was quick.
Oh, that was wrong. The one I saw. There's the
No,
right one.
I saw the right one.
1909.
Yep. And so I believe the first person to get that, scrolling up, let me check. Is that Wendy Westgate? Yeah, it looks like my panel went really fast. And so the first person to have it was Wendy. I'm going to just send her a quick DM. If you give us your mailing address,
Okay.
we'll mail you a tote bag of brown.
Well, I'm happy. I had a lot of fun. I hope you folks enjoyed this. So we'll talk, as they say.
Yes, we will absolutely. And Alan, thank you. This has been fascinating. We've had about 150 people participating, and we will share with you the chat, because we have so many people contributing about their ancestors, about name changes.
Hi, I'm gonna just jump in.
Yes, that's Melissa.
We did say this would go to 8:15, so we can give people. There's so many questions. I think we should try to take at least some of the more general questions, if that's okay.
Well, okay. You know what? Then I'd like to screen share again for about 4 or 5 minutes, because there are a couple of Steinfelds in the audience, and I want to explain why I'm not a Steinfeld. So let me get back to the screen. Screen share, there we are. Okay. So back to Grandma and Grandpa. So there's Moritz Steinfeld, but he's not really Moritz Steinfeld. He's really Laser Appel. Now, my parents knew that he was Laser. His Landsleit, the people who came from the same town that he came from, called him Lutze, a sort of nickname variant of Laser. And the Appel name was known to my father and to his siblings, but that's all they knew. So I set upon a search for Laser Appel. This is 1976, early in my career. I had been told by my folks that Grandpa had a cousin named Helen, maiden name Kuser Risa. And Helen was still alive in the late 70s, and I managed to talk with her. Helen remarkably had survived World War II by passing as a non-Jewish Polish woman and working in Berlin. And here is her work permit with her picture. You will learn in a few minutes how I came upon this. She confirmed that the family name was Appel. She did not know how she and my grandfather were cousins, but said that they definitely were cousins. And she gave the name of my grandfather's siblings and his parents. 1976, Soviet Union was still behind the Iron Curtain. There was really no way to investigate that. Jump ahead 20 years to 1995. Two things happened. Soviet Union had fallen apart. Poland was now opening its archives to researchers. And by 1995, I had some money that I could spend in hiring a researcher. Miriam Weiner is the person I hired, an outstanding researcher, no longer doing that. She's retired. She went to Poland, found records in the town of Żarnow, confirming all the information that Helen had given me, except for laser. There was no evidence of laser appel in the archives. She did find an Aaron Appel, born about the same time as Laser, same parents, same siblings. And I wondered if this was a sibling of his or perhaps even a twin. And that's where things stayed until last year when my brother called. And he was emptying out a drawer and found our parents, our father's will, called to ask me if I needed it. Well, I had a copy, but I went to my files just to make sure, and I found my parents' ketubah. In case there's anyone out there who doesn't know what a ketubah is, it's a marriage contract prepared between the bride and groom, stipulating the responsibilities of each party. Now, I had the ketubah for decades, but never looked at it closely for a couple of reasons. One, because my Hebrew is not very good, and secondly, because I thought I knew what was on it. But let's look at it together. Here's the ketubah, and it gives the name of the bride and the name of the groom, and then what their responsibilities are. Here's a close-up of the name of the groom, the Katan. Yossel, that's my father. Bar, son of. Now, I expected to see Laser or Eliezer, and that's over here. But there's this, which I couldn't make out. So I scanned it, sent it off to my rabbi, and immediately came back with, well, it's Aaron. So my grandfather was Aaron Laser Appel, and that's who Miriam Weiner found in 1995. Now, when I spoke to Helen, who's over here, she told me that she and Mr. Risa, the man she married in Europe in the camp, had one child, Martin. It took me in 2020 about 60 seconds to locate him. Reese is a very uncommon name. And I called him down in Florida, and he started crying. His son had just gotten married, and he thought he was the only person in the world, that he had no family. Helen had told me that all of the family, except for her and my grandfather, had been killed in Treblinka. So, as you can see from this chart, Martin is my third cousin. Our common ancestors are Ijik. Well, I'll leave that for Tomas to pronounce, but we have common great grandparents. So name changes. Okay. We've got a few minutes. Danielle?
Your story actually answers some of these questions, but what are some good resources specific to pre-World War II Europe?
I think the best single source is a website called Jewish Gen. Anne's shaking her head in agreement. Jewish Gen is now 25 or so years old, and organizes the genealogy material available from Europe and from the United States, allowing for the search of original documents. It also allows people to upload their family trees so that you can look at that and hopefully find a tree ready-made for you. They've got a free discussion group. Jewish Gen is completely free. It's on the list of sources that that you can get from the circle. It is volunteer run, donation supported, and if I can criticize it a little bit, it's that the interface is not the easiest to use. It takes a bit of doing, but they do have introductory material that shows you how to go about doing it. Let me give you a 1 minute how to do genealogy. You start by interviewing yourself, by really formally asking yourself what you know, how far back and how far down, if you are of a certain age and have grandchildren, and if you know who your grandparents are, that's 5 generations already and probably spans over 100 years. So you put that down and you document it as best you can, not just your knowledge, personal communication from yourself, but you gather together whatever you can in the way of documents, and then you apply genealogical thinking, knowing that a grandparent lived in a certain area at a certain time. You set about finding what kinds of documents would exist. In Eastern European countries and Central European countries, there were taxes collected. So there are tax records, there are property ownership records, there were censuses held periodically for different reasons. But again, the place to start is with by finding out what you already know, and that will lead you back to what you don't know, and then you can start looking. Anything else, Danielle?
Just checking. I mean,
People are asking for your last story. You have one more?
I think that was his last
That
story.
was your last story? Okay,
Yeah.
just checking.
That's why for the appels in the
Okay.
in the audience, I'm not really a Steinfeld. For the
Okay.
Steinfelds in the audience, I'm an interloper.
Okay,
And I don't know how Grandpa got that name Steinfeld. You know, where it came from, don't know.
okay, good. So Ron Newman has been satisfied.
Someone asked a while back about, I mean, because we talked about domestic traveling, how people would have traveled via train. Someone asked about how people traveled like within Europe. So say this person's relative came from Lutz and then traveled via Liverpool. How would have they gone within Europe? How would they traveled?
By train, overwhelmingly by train. Europe has a very good train system, and the shipping companies, to encourage people to take their ship, would have arrangement with train companies, so you could get on the train in Bialystok, and you would be checked through, so to speak, right to Hamburg or Rotterdam or wherever you were traveling from. The Liverpool would be an intermediate stop. So the boat would take you from Hamburg, from the mainland European port, sometimes to a port in England, Liverpool being a common one, where either they would load more passengers or transfer you to a bigger ship for the crossing.
So Alan, do you do consulting?
I don't do consulting. This this is a hobby. I consulted medically for a long time, and well, I do consulting for friends and neighbors and what have you, but not in a professional capacity.
If someone wanted to hire a genealogy consultant, how would you recommend they go about doing that?
I mentioned, or at the very beginning, Anne mentioned that I've written articles for Avotenu. Avotenu is it's a publishing company. One of the things they publish is the International Journal of Jewish Genealogy. If you go to the Avotenu website, you may be able to find a link for hiring a professional genealogist. Certainly, you could subscribe to the journal for a year, and there are a number of people who advertise their services. Ancestry, the commercial genealogy app, website, also has listings for professional genealogists. I hired one person once with a very specific goal. I think doing the starting research is well within the abilities of people who are watching tonight. You can join your local Jewish genealogy society, and they are all over the world now, and hook into their website. You can pose questions there. Genealogists tend to be very friendly, helpful people, so you can get started doing it. And then your focus on what it is exactly that you want a hired gun to do for you will become clearer.
Right, and I think that's about it for now. Thank you so much again for your knowledge and enthusiasm and expertise here. We really
Thank you, Alan. And
it was a pleasure.
We're so excited that we are going to be having a course. So I think you have about 150 people looking to take it.
Well, it's I've taught this course before. In fact, I'm in the middle of teaching it in 2 different locations. It's a lot of fun, and if you don't mind hosting me, I'd like to offer it through the circle.
Are you kidding? We would be subject to a riot if we said no, and I'm thrilled. It's a one. Thank you. A Shanam Donk. It's a wonderful offer,
and
it's perfectly aligned with our mission, and it's yet another entry into our heritage. It's wonderful.
Well, let me put a plug in for Tomas for his presentation. Tomas is not only a skilled teacher and a gute neshama, but a heck of a nice guy. It was a delight to spend 2 weeks in Lithuania and Poland with him. Well worth attending his session.
And if you're interested in traveling with him and with us, please keep an eye out. We're going to be announcing new dates, and it's truly a trip of a lifetime.
Yes, I took it, not to be missed.
Yeah.
We'll be in touch via email, but also don't forget to follow us, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and Facebook. We're on Twitter.
And we may be posting parts of this program on YouTube. We'll see. So just stay tuned.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a wrap, and good night, and thank you so much, Alan. Looking forward to seeing you again soon.
Very
Maybe
good.
in person.
Very good.
Take good care.
Bye-bye.